and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Later this year, from July 26th to August 11th, the Summer Olympic Games will be hosted in Paris, France. That marks the first time the Summer Olympics have been in Paris for exactly 100 years, since 1924. So, today, we'll be talking about a movie that is set during those 1924 Olympic Games, Chariots of Fire. Chariots of Fire was directed by Hugh Hudson and stars an ensemble cast headed up by Ben Cross and Ian Charleson, who play as Harold Abrams and Eric Liddell, respectively. Abrams and Liddell are athletes who ran for Great Britain during the aforementioned 1924 Olympics in Paris. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, today we'll be joined by Jill Jaracz and Alison Brown, the hosts of Keep the Flame Alive podcast, which is all about the Olympics and Paralympics. Before we connect with Jill and Alison, though, it's time to set up our game, Two Truths and a Lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you three things right now, and two of them are true, but one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Sybil Gordon and Harold Abrams were married years before the timeline of the movie. Number two, there were ads in the 1924 Olympics. Number three, Lord Andrew Lindsay is not a real person. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Jill and Alison from Keep the Flame Alive podcast about the historical accuracy of Chariots of Fire. Before we dive into some of the details, let's take a step back, look at the movie from an overall perspective. If you were to give Chariots of Fire a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get? And Jill, let's start with you.
You know, I'd give it a C-. It could be lower if they didn't get some of the details right. We're really good in this movie with getting the truths accurate, but how they got to those truths is there's a lot of stuff wrong in this movie.
I'm probably being overly generous because I do adore this movie. So I was wavering between a B and a B-, simply because I think they get the spirit of the story very accurate. They get the spirit of the characters, but a lot of the details are fuzzy. I'm being kind. But there's a reason, to make the story more cinematic. They did need to compress time, and they did need to give it more drive.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, it is a movie for entertainment. And that's something that I hear a lot is, well, they got some of the key points, but how they connect those dots, of course, again, it's a movie and they got to compress time and they got to add or remove characters or, whatever is needed for entertainment purposes to hit some of those high points. So it makes perfect sense.
Well, when we watch some movies, sometimes they're so inaccurate that the main facts that they get right is there is an event called the Olympics, and it did happen in the year. We're better than that on Chariots of Fire, but not a ton.
There's definitely grading on a curve when it comes to Olympic movies.
I get that. There's been some movies I've seen where the text that they have at the end in a lot of movies, they even got that wrong. It's like you were just typing it out and they still got it wrong. So it happens.
Well, we'll get to that, right? Because we want to talk about the text at the end.
We'll get to that. But in the movie, there are a number of characters that it follows. Harold Abrams and Eric Liddell are kind of the two main characters, but there's also Lord Andrew Lindsay, Aubrey Montague, and Henry Stollard. And they're all runners. The movie backs up to the year 1919 to show them meeting at the University of Cambridge. Or maybe they didn't all meet there because we see Harold arriving at university along with Aubrey Montague. Were all of these actually real people who met at Cambridge?
Sort of and sort of. The big one is Andrew Lindsay is not a real person, but he's based on Lord Burleigh. So because David Burleigh did not like some inaccuracies in the movie and did not allow his name to be used. So they created Lord Andrew Lindsay, who's actually my favorite character in the whole movie. The others that you mentioned are accurate. However, Aubrey Montague did not go to Cambridge. He went to Oxford. And he and Harold became friends later, but that relationship between the two was accurate. They were very close. They were dear friends for the rest of their lives afterwards. So that's what I mean where I say they get the spirit right, but not all the details.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting that a lot of times they'll in movies they pull multiple people together to then become a composite character of one, but it sounds like it was still one to one, but just it's a fascinating reason to change their name. I mean, it makes sense if they're not happy with it.
He was the only one of them, I believe, that was still alive at the point when the movie was being made. So he was really the only one they had to worry about getting any kind of permissions or avoiding lawsuits. And he said no. And then after he saw the movie, he was sorry.
Oh.
He was sorry that he had his name removed.
So he hadn't even seen the movie when they talked about when he said that it was not accurate.
Right. It was actually the the run at the beginning of the movie, because Burley was the first man to actually do that, not Abrams, not until 1928. And that inaccuracy made him so mad that he said, "You can't use my name."
Wow.
And then he was sorry, I think, because of that catching the spirit of those absolutely amazing men of the time.
Speaking of Cambridge, one of the things that we see happen almost right away is something called the College Dash. And the movie explains it as a race where you go from beneath the clock around the perimeter of the court, the university, and the time it takes for the clock to chime midday. The movie says it's a distance of 188 paces, something no one has ever completed in over 700 years. And then we see Harold complete the challenge almost as soon as he arrives at Cambridge. Was Harold really the first person in 700 or some years to complete the College Dash at Cambridge?
Well, he never tried to do the college dash, first off. So that's an inaccuracy there. Also, the movie could not get permission to film at Cambridge. So what you see isn't exactly what it's going to look like in real life. And they do have this great court run still, but one of the interesting things is that the time depends on how the bells are doing that day. And sometimes in different types of weather, they'll ring faster or slower. So it's you never quite know what you're going to get.
That has to be frustrating.
But I think it does. I think why they put it in A, the wrong year, and B, making Abrams do it is to kind of establish that runner with intense speed that can do things that no other man has technically not done before, if you're going to go by the history of this movie. So it does help, yeah, it does help establish him as a character of, it helps establish him as a runner who's really fast.
Yeah, kind of setting him apart from everybody else right away.
I think it also sets us time and place very well. This Cambridge world of that post World War I era. So we get a real feel of the place with that court run.
There is another person that we see in the movie, Ian Holmes' character, Sam Musabini. And when Harold hires Sam, it really starts to stir up some controversy. There's a scene in the movie where Harold is talking to a character simply cast as the Master of Caius, one of the colleges at Cambridge. And he tells Harold that this university believes that the way of the amateur is the only one to provide satisfactory results. And he goes on to tell Harold that he's too much of an individualistic mindset instead of a team spirit. Harold denies this, but then again, we don't see any of the other runners really seem to have a trainer. Was the movie accurate to suggest that Cambridge leadership didn't like Harold hiring a trainer?
Well, I think that an interesting true fact is Eric Liddell introduced Sam Musabini to Harold Abrams. So Musabini was well known in the field. In fact, Albert Hill, who was a great British runner from 1920, also trained with Mussolini. So Mussolini was traveling around these circles. Now, would it have been likely, we don't know this factually, that Cambridge authorities probably didn't like that professional aspect? Probably not. They wanted this ideal of the gentleman amateur athlete. So having these outsider coaches may have been frowned upon, but it was pretty standard at the time, but I think done quietly.
And when I was watching that, it made sense to me that they would have a trainer. And so it kind of threw me off that, I mean, I guess it's a different time period, but also like athletes have trainers, they have coaches, they have people that help them.
Right. You had this paradox of the Olympics at that time being for amateurs, and by that they mean rich men, probably white. And that it's hard to see that as you go through history, this insistence that sport be for amateurs and the Olympics be an amateur sport, and just going on talent, when really the Olympics were a lot of, who's got the money, who's got the money to be able to afford to have the time off to train. And you do need some kind of coach to train at those levels. And when you get further and further in Olympic history, you start seeing where money goes under the table to pay people, and in all of the sham of amateurism, until it kind of shatters in 1992 when professional athletes, namely the dream team NBA players, were allowed to start playing in the Olympics.
So kind of taking us back to that time period with the Olympics being amateur, was it, because I think of Olympic athletes these days, we think of them pretty much training 24/7. Like that's what they do. So then were there people who weren't allowed in the Olympics because they were professionals then? Like they were prohibited?
Oh, absolutely. Uh, you know, uh, Jim Thorpe was stripped of his medals.
Oh wow. So he was allowed in but then stripped. Wow.
Right, it sort of in this same, a little bit earlier, but same idea, time period, and because he had played professional baseball in the bush leagues, and the idea of earning money from any kind of sport was frowned upon by Olympic officials. So, the idea was you had to be this gentleman athlete, this person who only pursued sport for the pursuit of excellence, not to make money from it.
Wow, that's a very different mindset than I think of today.
And we see it doesn't really work.
I mean, you're not going to get the best of the best. Like you can't. You just think of, you got to put food on the table. You got to pay bills. You got to make money somehow. And if
Right, and yeah, and you see as you go along in time again, where athletes are in the army, or they have a police job where they get paid, and their job during the day is really to go work out and train for the games. And you see that in different countries all throughout time. Because it's impossible to do the ironically, Paris 1924 is when the Olympic motto was first launched, Citius Altius Fortius, which is faster, higher, stronger. How are you going to get faster, higher, and stronger if you don't spend more time or more quality time working out?
yeah, with trainers.
Or glasses of champagne balanced
Right.
on your hurdles. I mean, that takes money to be able to train like that.
Yes, I would just do water. But if we go back into the movie, we do see Harold and the other guys go to a play, and he is smitten with one of the actresses there named Sybil. He asks her out, and the two seem to hit it off. How well does the movie do showing the way that Harold and Sybil met?
Oh, they are so wrong. It's not even the right Sybil. So Sybil Gordon, who is the character in the movie, was a famous opera singer and operetta performer, but that's not who Harold got involved with. He actually married Sybil Evers, who was not a star. She was a backup singer, for lack of a better word. And he did not get involved with her until 34, 35. But Harold Abrams was a big fan of Gilbert and Sullivan. So that part is true.
But when you look at the movies of the time, you got to get the ladies in with a love story, apparently. So that seems to be one of the elements where Sybil is really besides Eric Little's sister, there's only 2 female characters in the whole movie. And if you put in this love story, it is a vehicle that allows different things to happen. So there is that.
That is a great point. And I guess since we were kind of talking about the Olympics being a different time, were there women's running and women's sports?
There were some women's sports, but not a ton. We're getting into a period of time where, of course, because the men of the International Olympic Committee also did not like women. Specifically, Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympic movement, really did not like women. So women were sort of there in smaller sports or smaller events. We get kind of after Paris, there's a women's movement that has their own Olympics. They call them the Women's Olympics, and they were very popular for a few years. And then the International Olympic Committee saw the threat and said, why don't you ladies come in with our event? So they could shut that down. So you're getting into an area where some women are there in different capacities, but not a ton.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even think about that watching the movie then until you brought that up.
I mean, you do see women marching in with the teams, and that's kind of interesting. But yeah, there's just no focus on women in this time.
Well, even though it's the wrong Sybil, she mentions that her brother is a big fan of Harold's, and that makes me think that Harold had already kind of made a name for himself in the sport. Did a lot of people know who he was even before he became an Olympian?
Well, he was an Olympian in 1920.
Oh, okay.
Which this movie leaves out entirely. And he had 2 brothers who were Olympians in 1912. So he was a rather well-known athlete at the time.
Yeah, the movie just completely omits those Olympics.
Yeah, 1920 doesn't exist because the movie does start in 1919. And we have this little 1920 Olympics that happened, but not in this world. Well, that's the story they wanted to tell. The 20 Olympics would have been a distraction in the arc of the story. So I see why they did it. And I know I'm so forgiving because I love this movie.
Well, and Abrams didn't do particularly well in those Olympics. He did not medal. So it makes sense to, if we're going to start with him as one of the best sprinters in the world, let's ignore the fact that he had a middling performance at at his first Olympics, and let's just focus on the good part.
So that makes me wonder then, if he didn't do well in the 1920 Olympics, was that why he hired a trainer then to try to get better in 24, or had he already hired Mussolini before that, or just kind of what was the timeline on that?
No, Mussolini came after 1920. So it is likely, we don't really have a lot of what was in Harold Abrams' mind. He was a typical Brit of the day and didn't share his inner thoughts. But likely it would have been he hired Mussolini because he wanted to do better next time around and do better than his brothers. So he wanted to have that achievement for 24.
Well, we are at the point in the movie where the runners go to the Olympics, and these 1924 Olympics. But before we talk about the events there, how well do you think the movie did just transporting us back to 1924 for the Olympics in Paris?
I thought they did really well. And one of the details, and a surprising detail that they just nail, is the fact that there is advertising in the stadium. And if any of your listeners followed the Olympics, you might notice that the Olympics, and since 2020, the Paralympics as well, there is no advertising on the field of play at all. It is these are the only sporting events that you will not see advertising at. And that's a particular desire of the International Olympic Committee to have this clean field of play and focus on sport. The exception is Paris 1924, where the organizers said, we've got to make some money because we're still kind of after World War I. The 1920 Olympics were a miracle that they happened. Basically, they were in Antwerp. Antwerp had, there was no money to put these on, but somehow they still managed to put them on. 1924, we're still in hey, we need some money. So the organizer said, let's sell advertising. And they did. And the International Olympic Committee said after those games, we will never have advertising in the stadium again. So this is the one place where you do see it. And it's really kind of interesting that they do that. The stadium that they use in the movie, it's not the same stadium, but the stadium that they use still exists. And it's going to be a venue at the 2024 Olympics. This year, it will be the field hockey tournament venue.
With no advertising, I'm assuming.
With no advertising. I think also the uniforms, the opening ceremonies, the feel of it with the crowd, the way the crowd behaves is very indicative of sporting events at the time. And the way that they show them training and the way that they show them behaving and the things that they had available in terms of equipment and what the track looked like and how they did things. There are no starting blocks. They're digging the holes for their feet. All those things were very, very accurate.
That was something I noticed. Yeah, digging themselves. Yeah.
Digging themselves, and also the ropes marking off the lane lines. That is also an accurate fact from those games. It's very interesting how all of these little details really work to give you the spirit of what those games were like. I thought they did a really good job in that aspect.
Was that only those games then that they used the ropes?
It was indicative of the era. I don't know when that came in and out. I want to say we still saw those in 28 and 32, but they're gone by 36.
I didn't know if it was something like the advertising where they change things around, just kind of for these games and then realize, that's not going to work.
Yeah, that was more a question of what International Track and Field was doing as opposed to what the Olympics were doing. But one note I want to make about the advertiser is that the advertisements that they use in the movie, if you look at pictures from 24, they even got the ads themselves right. They really copied that perfectly. So certain details they were absolutely dead on about.
I'm going to have to go back and look at the ads now and see which ones they are. Cause I mean, again, it's something where I'm just used to seeing ads all the time. And so it's one of those things where I didn't really think a lot about that.
Right. And when the first time I saw this movie, which I only saw it for the first time a few years ago, I, of course, grew up with the music and the movie if you're of a certain age, but I didn't watch the whole thing until a few years ago. And that was one of the details that stuck out to me was this advertising. And I thought, oh man, they put product placement in this movie, not really realizing that, no, there was actually advertising at the time. But they did a great job with that.
One of the things we see throughout the movie is Eric Little's dedication to his Christian beliefs. It culminates during the Olympics when he refuses to run on a Sunday. And the way that this plays out in the movie makes me think that maybe there is some Hollywood creative license at play. Not that that's surprising, but there's a scene in the movie that takes place while the Olympics are taking place, where Lord Lindsay tells the committee that he already got a medal, so maybe he can swap places with Little on a 400-meter race because it's on a Thursday. It's not like Little was ever trying to hide his faith or anything, or that he wasn't going to run on a Sunday. So it was something that, as I was watching, I was like, well, they could have figured this out a long time beforehand than doing it during the Olympics. How well did the movie do showing Eric Little's not wanting to run on Sundays in this swap?
Well, okay. Let's start with the good. Yes, Eric Little did, in fact, refuse to run on Sundays. That was absolutely true because of his faith. However, he didn't find out as he was getting on the boat to go over there. The schedule for the Olympics is, even back in those days, was published months in advance. So this was a months-long discussion. One thing they did get right was the Prince of Wales at the time did get involved and did actually reach out to Eric Liddell, but not on the boat, many, many months in advance. So that swap between the 100 and the 400 was made long before they got to Paris. Liddell was training for many months for the 400, knowing he was not going to run, not just in the 100, but also because he was not running in the 100, would not be running in the 4x100 relay. So the whole British team was aware that they were going to have to swap out their relay runners. So they really, we talked at the very beginning, compressed the time for dramatic effect. So so that in and of itself is problematic. And then the swap out is problematic because no, you can't just suddenly run in a different length race a few days before. That's not going to happen. And Lord Burleigh, who Lindsay is based on, did not medal in 24. So saying, oh, I'll just give you my race. You can't do that. You can't just swap out and exchange athletes. In 24, you could certainly do it more easily. Now, a particular athlete is assigned that spot, not the country. Because the country, when they earn a quota spot, then assigns an athlete to that slot. You can't just swap them out the way that it was done in the movie. So yeah, there was a lot of problems, but it was a great scene.
Yeah. It was, although when you talk about the medals too, I thought it was so just casual. The way he's like, well, I already got my medal. So like, basically I'm done with the Olympics now. I got my medal. I'm good. Like we can change.
Bring the champagne.
Yeah. It's like, I'm done. Were there any swaps or anything like that? Was that, I mean, you said it was probably easier back then, but is that something that can happen for any reason?
So sometimes people would not be signed up for an event. Like a big thing you hear about stories of the Olympics, say pre-World War II. Oh, I just decided to run the marathon. I've never run a marathon before, but let's do it. And they did, and they'd win a medal. So you hear those stories. And you hear of athletes, oh, this athlete was injured and was replaced. Once you get into where we are today, there's such strict quotas. There's so many more athletes, so many more countries, so much more professionalism in a certain way that if an athlete is, say, injured at the games, an individual athlete, not a team member, you can't just put somebody else in that slot. So let's say the U.S. has 3 slots for the 100 meters. They're assigned to individual athletes. You can't just give that slot away up to a point. There's a certain date where your list of entries has to be there, and you can't be swapping it on the boat over, let's say. But certainly in team sports, obviously, if somebody gets injured, another player on the team can replace that player. But it is a much stricter list of names that's going to the Olympics than in 1924. So the idea that they could just swap out probably was true then, but it didn't happen this way.
Because the mentality being, we were talking about amateur versus professional, you're going to have almost a different type of mentality for the athletes going into it than we have now, where the athletes are training all the time, all day, every day, pretty much. And so I could, yeah, I don't know. When I was watching that, I was just like, there's got to be some creative license here, because even then they had to know when the races were going to be. It's not a surprise.
Right. And I think it would have made for a boring film if you had months ahead of time. Oh, we're going to meet with you to pressure you to join. 2 months later, let's meet with you again to pressure you to run the 100. And that would get confusing and it would get boring really quickly. So this was a nice way to heighten that drama without, and yeah, you took a little license, but you've made a better movie out of it.
Well, there are 2 big races kind of near the end of the movie. And the first one is with Harold running a 100-meter race. His coach, Sam, isn't there. I thought that was interesting that Sam decided not to go, but instead he sends Harold a letter with a good luck charm. We don't see anything about how fast he ran, but we do see him winning. And there's a shot of Sam hearing "God Save the King" playing from the stadium where the race happened. So Sam knows that Harold won. How well do you think the movie did portraying Harold's gold medal victory?
Well, he won the gold medal. and the race, the race outcome was correct.
This is the example of there were Olympics, and that did happen.
Yes. But the problem is in 1924, they did not have medal ceremonies. So there was no podium. There was no "God Save the King" being played. Harold got his medal in the mail. So yeah, it came months later. So the way Sam hears it, obviously that's something we would not relate to today or even in the 1980s. You just use that as a dramatic license. We know that when you win, you get on a podium. And if they hadn't had that, they would have gone and they didn't do this in 1924. Are you kidding me? There's always been a podium at the Olympics. And I think that would have confused an average audience member even more.
That makes sense. Would that be tied then to your saying they needed money in 1924? Would that kind of be tied to that they didn't have these extra celebrations?
Right. And a lot of the traditions that we know from the Olympics today are still being developed. So this is the first Olympics with the motto. The Olympics rings came in just a couple of Olympics. Those were 1912, right, Alison? So 1912 was the first time we got the Olympic rings, and the Olympics started again in 1896. So that's coming. The torch relay won't come until and the torch relay and the cauldron lighting's not coming until 1936. So a lot of the different things that you see and we take for granted today are still being developed and evolving during this time frame.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I didn't think about. Yeah, it's the Olympics. They've got to have a ceremony.
But in that way, it also makes going back that far really fun to see the evolution of sports. And when you think about even during what's happened in your lifetime, the evolution of something that's important to you, how that's changed. And if you're in the beginning of say a new sport or a new activity, or like, the evolution of video games, seeing that history play out and living through that history is really kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. And it's indicative too, I think, of what elements of it we've just become associated with the Olympics. Like we just assume that that's going to be there. So if it is more historically accurate and doesn't have it, we're going to think it's wrong. We're going to think it's not being historically accurate. And so it's interesting the decisions that the filmmakers would have to make to what to include, what not to include, what to purposely not include or include.
What I think they get so right in that time frame is the scene of how Harold reacts to his medal, how Harold reacts to his win, and in that the locker room scene beforehand, before the race. And I didn't realize it until we started doing our podcast and we spoke to Charlie White, who's a gold medalist in ice dance. And he talked about right before he and his partner went out for their final skate, he was thinking to himself, what happens if we just leave the stadium? What happens if I just walk out? Like the pressure was so intense and that feeling was so overwhelming that despite having trained for it for, 20 plus years, he was ready to just walk out the door. So I think that intense scene, both before and after that race when he wins, is perfect in a movie making and probably what is in a lot of athletes' heads.
And I was going to ask about that because we do see Harold after he wins, he just seems very down, very glum, very, not happy as you would expect after winning a gold medal.
Right. And we talk with a lot of Olympians and you hear this after games, there's just a level of depression that happens because they've been putting everything they have into this one moment. And when it's done, what do you do? And especially if it's not the outcome you wanted, even in Abram's case, it's the outcome he wanted. But now you feel kind of empty because you're just kind of lost. And It's very interesting to see that because as a viewer of the games, I would not think that they would have that impact on a person, but they do, and it's one of the things we're starting to see people talk a little bit more about now is the post games depression and the post games blues, and how do you deal with that and trying to manage that ahead of trying to get ahead of the 8 ball there and managing it so that it's not as intense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of what we were going back to before too, talking about, amateur versus professional. I imagine that would add another level of struggle to it. It's like, okay, I won the gold medal, but what can I do with this now? It's like it can't be my profession because they won't allow professionals. And so you kind of be like, what now?
Right, and you get that with athletes in smaller sports today. I mean, you're not gonna be a professional rower, you're not gonna be a professional modern pentathlete. There's really not that much money in those sports, and so having to have another life to go with it and make sure you have another life when and build that other life, it can be really hard.
Earlier, I did mention there were two races kind of at the end. We talked about the first of those, but then the second last race that we see in the movie is we see Harold is in the stands. He's at the Olympics cheering on. Eric is now the one racing. And we hear the dialogue that Eric has already run 2 races that day. So his opponents just think he's going to be dead tired, but it doesn't seem to affect him. Eric wins. And then again, we don't really get a lot of details about the other races or even the time that Eric ran in this last race. So can you fill in some details around Eric's winning race that we don't really see much in the movie?
Yes and no. Trying to find the exact schedule of races from 1924 is a little tricky, but I will say that the 200 was run after the 100. And then the 400, which Eric Little did win, I think is also run before the 100.
No.
No, you
No,
have it?
no. I don't have the 100, but the 200 was held before the 400.
Right.
And they're held over 2 days. So you have round 1 and the quarterfinals on the first day, and then the semifinals and the finals on the second day. So these athletes are already used to running multiple races on a day. So the fact that Little's run 2 races already, which, for the 400 didn't happen because he only ran 2 races total. That's a little bit of an inaccuracy, but he would have been fine. So you have, and they're spaced a little bit apart. So in round 1, which had 17 heats in the 400, and that's part of the reason why we're not going to see all of these races because you'll get lost as a viewer if you're watching 4 rounds of one event. So, that'll start at 2:00. 2 hours later is your quarterfinals. The next day starts at 2:45 and your finals are at 5:30. So there's some resting time in between. And there athletes also know at this level, still even in 1924, to save a little bit in the tank for the finals. Do what you have to do to get into the next round. It's not gonna be as fast, but then in the finals, that's when you really bring it.
Would that be kind of across the board for all the athletes then, that they would all be running about the same number of races? Or you have some that are, because like in the movie, I get the impression that Eric has run more. They're like, oh, yeah, I ran 2 races today. So I get the impression he's run more than the other athletes that are running the same race, or they all kind of run the same.
I think with that, they're going back to this, oh, you can run the 400 2 days before, yeah, or we're gonna put you in the 400, swap you out here at the event kind of thing. And I think that's what they're using that as a mechanism to heighten the drama versus it's not another day at the office, but they know how to do this work.
And all the runners in the finals have run the same number of rounds to get to the finals.
Okay.
So it's not like, oh, they had to run extra races to get there. It's all, heats, quarters, semis, finals.
Sure. Okay. And just to kind of almost take a step back from those races, because we do see in the movie a lot of races that are mentioned. Like I talk about Lord Lindsay, when he's like, oh, I already won my medal. He just mentions that. We don't really see that. So just Can you give kind of an overall timeline, kind of what sort of races were run then?
Right. Well, we don't see any of the heats. We only see
So we're only
finals.
seeing the finals. Okay.
We're only seeing the finals. So when Lindsay runs the hurdles, when Montague runs the steeplechase, rounds have happened before then, but we're seeing the finals of those. So they skip all the things that don't involve a medal.
Because we hear them talk about some of them in some of the dialogue. Like there's some stuff going on that we don't actually see. And so I was curious how much we're not seeing in the movie.
And that could have ended up on the cutting room floor as well. So I would not be surprised if some of the minor character stories were much bigger to start with, and then they just got trimmed down a little bit.
Well, we talked about the kind of the text at the end, and at the very end of the movie, there is an explanation of what happened to Harold and Eric. It says, Harold married Sybil, became the elder statesman of British athletes, and then died in January of 1978. Eric became a missionary, died at the end of World War II in occupied China, something that all of Scotland mourned. Is that a pretty good summary of what really happened to Harold and Eric after the timeline of the movie?
And, Harold married a different Sybil, but did in fact become the elder statesman of sports. He was injured in 1925, so his athletic career ended very quickly after the Paris Olympics, but he was involved in sports for the rest of his life. And that was very accurate, as was Eric's story.
Right. Harold did commentary. He did a lot of athletics work. You can still find races with his commentary today, and that's really fun to hear. Eric was in captivity when he died, but he also had a brain tumor, and that part was left off the writing, but the rest of it is still quite accurate.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they included in that writing that Eric married and had 3 daughters. I don't think they did. So, yeah, so he did marry and have a family, who actually, were allowed to have private screenings of the movie, and filmmakers were very, responsive to his daughters, and, they cried apparently and were very moved by it, so it was because they barely knew him, because he died so very young, as did, in fact, the actor who played him. Ian Charleson also died much too soon, so that was a very sad, parallel in the story.
There was something that we see throughout the movie I want to ask about with Harold Abrams. He has to deal with a lot of anti-Semitism. Was that something that he really faced?
We can't go by anything that he talked about because it wasn't something that he talked about. Was there significant anti-Semitism in Great Britain in the 1920s, especially in the upper classes? Yeah. I mean, was that true in the United States? Yeah. So I think we can assume that that sort of casual anti-Semitism that is shown throughout the movie was probably something that he frequently dealt with.
Speaking of kind of in the era, since Chariots of Fire came out in 1981, let's say you're in charge of the remake. What would you do differently?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Don't you dare remake this movie. This movie is perfect as it is. It's hard for me to imagine a remake because I think Ian Charleson and Ben Cross were so perfectly cast. That would be the hard thing for me to see somebody else play those roles because I thought they just embodied these men and the spirit so perfectly. But yeah, I could do without the romance, I think.
I will say I'm impressed at how well this movie holds up, but if I was in charge of a remake, controversial thought, I would change the score. You have this, honestly, one of the most iconic soundtracks in movie history with a wonderful theme until, and it sets you right in 1924 until the synthesizers start and put you squarely in 1981. And that happens all throughout the movie is all of a sudden you've got this music that starts and then the synthesizers come in and it's so jarring. And I get it. It is an amazing score and that song is just iconic, but oh boy, it really that really dates the movie in a 1980s way, and it's sad that it takes it has some elements that make you feel like it's 1924 and set you in the 20s, but it just pulls you right back into the 80s.
I honestly was not expecting that to be even on the table for that. That's fair.
Me neither. I'm a little horrified right now. Jill and I are going to have a talk after this.
Well, it got me again when I rewatched the movie. Like, it's a fabulous song, fabulous theme, but right when the synthesizers come in, I am back in 1981. Boy, am I back in 1981.
You wouldn't even do it for like the nostalgia of, a remake of knowing that this was in the 80s, and so do it in some sort of an...
No, I mean, I would take this. I would orchestrate the synthesizers and just same music, just orchestrate it. But if you wanted to do a remake and update, I would set it in 1924 and have some good hip hop to it.
Okay. I would like to see the version that has that.
If I could beatbox, I would beatbox this theme right now.
This is like Jackson Schultz throwing down the rhymes in the middle of the movie.
Oh, can we talk about the fact that he slid Eric a note right before the start of the final?
Okay, so I'm so glad you mentioned this, Jill, and this is why we work together. That is actually accurate, but no, but it wasn't Jackson Schultz. So the moment that Jill is referring to is right before Eric runs his race. Was it Charlie Paddock?
One of the Americans.
One of the Americans hands him a note. It's a Bible quote and basically is affirming Eric Little's decision to not run on Sunday, and God will see what you're doing and honor you. The team massage therapist actually did slip Eric Little a note with the Bible verse and the words of encouragement prior to his race. But of course, making the American opponent do it brings the height of the cinematic world to us. But that actually happened.
Wow. Yeah, the moment, because I did wonder, like, okay, you get this note at the start line, and he crumples it up, but like, where does it? He doesn't throw it down his shirt or in a pocket or something like that.
It's in his hand, but not always, because if it's one of those inconsistencies where sometimes in some shots you can see it in his hand, and in some shots it's not there. But at the end, it is in his hand.
Wow, and I could see how adding the competitive side from the Americans, but also making it in the movie a lot more tense, because if the swap did happen so quickly, kind of at the end there, then maybe he'll flip flop back, and maybe he'll change his mind or whatever, and adding the tension in the movie.
And Americans are it's funny that we love this movie because the Americans come off so bad. They're just awful in this movie. In that way that British people would portray them in the movie, arrogant and loud and all those wonderful things about us.
Because we love the synthesizer. That's what it is.
Yeah, that music immediately makes you want to run on a beach in slow motion with sand getting kicked up in your mouth.
Was there anything else from the true story that did not make its way into the movie that you wish had been included?
One of the things that they got wrong was Eric's relationship with his sister. And I actually think the real relationship would have been more interesting. Jenny was extremely supportive of Eric's running career and saw it as a way to spread their faith, to honor God. God gave you this talent. And I thought that the unnecessary fighting between them actually diminished her as a character. It made her seem very small. And I think seeing her as a support for when he was struggling would have been a more interesting portrayal of one of the only two, as Jill mentioned, one of the only two female characters. And could have actually been a nice parallel with how Sybil supports Harold and how Jenny could have supported Eric.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think It created an additional conflict where we already had enough conflicts to deal with. You're dealing with conflicts of religion and other people's perceptions of what you should do. You're dealing with conflicts of your ability to race, and you're competing against other athletes. To have this other made up conflict, just it was very flat.
Oh, and Harold Abrams had a stash in real life that was amazing. Really good 1920s mustache that, Ben Cross could have rocked and looked very handsome
For the
with.
aerodynamics, right?
Absolutely.
Well, we have been talking a lot about history today. Of course, the next Olympic Games, 2024 Games, also in Paris. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the first time they've been back to Paris since the events in the Chariots of Fire we've been talking about in 1924. So kind of shifting from history to the future, what are you most looking forward to as you're attending and report on the 2024 Paris Games?
We are. We get to go. We have media accreditation, so we get to cover them as press. I have never been to Paris, so this is gonna be my first foray, and I think just being in such a historic place for that anniversary, for that 100 years, and they're using a lot of iconic elements. So there's going to be events at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. The marathon and the road races are gonna go down the Champs-Élysées and past the Arc de Triomphe, and the Grand Palais is being used. So I think being in those historic, amazing places with this kind of historic, amazing event is gonna be like no other Olympics.
Right, and Paris 2024 has had a lot of nods to 1924 in its branding, so it's got a lot of Art Deco typography. The symbol of the games, if you look at it one way, it looks like a flame. If you look at it another way, it looks like Marianne, who is one of their symbols of freedom. Um, I am looking forward to an Olympics where fans are able to go. The last 2 games have been under COVID, so there's a lot of pent-up excitement about getting to go to the games again and getting all of the fan interaction that we've been missing, and that energy in the stadiums that we've been missing. I'm also really looking forward to the French just bringing their French ways in the I mean, we look back at the last time that France hosted something was, the 1992 Winter Olympics, and if you go back and look at those opening ceremonies, there's a lot of cirque, performances going on. It's a little out there, in terms of theatricalness. I am waiting to see what they do in terms of out there in theatricalness with the opening ceremonies and the closing ceremonies. The opening ceremonies will be like nothing we've ever seen in Olympics because they will be going the Parade of Nations will be going down the Seine River for like 6 kilometers. And it's just going to be mammoth in size and scale. Out there, the mascot is a hat. It is it is a Frisian hat, which is another symbol from the French Revolution. So I am just excited to see what the French are going to do differently and bring it. And it's just an amazing backdrop, like Allison said, to have the games come back post COVID.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on to chat about Chariots of Fire, and we'll enjoy the games through vicariously through both of you. Your podcast called Keep the Flame Alive, which I'll include a link to in the show notes for this episode. But can you share an overview of your podcast for our listeners?
Well, we are 4 fans of the Olympics and Paralympics, so we do anything about the games that you might be curious about. So we'll talk with athletes about how their sports work, and we do that to find those little details so that when you're watching, you can be smarter than everybody else on the couch. We talk with people behind the scenes because it's not just the athletes at the games. It takes years to put these together. There are wonderful people behind the scenes who work really hard and do some amazing things. So we'll talk with announcers. We'll talk with photographers. We've talked with officials before to figure out what they do and what they bring to the games as well. We also cover the Paralympics, and that is if you haven't watched the Paralympics, do yourself a favor and watch them this year because the athleticism is amazing, and just they have some different sports that you don't see in the Olympics that are really, really fun to watch, and you'll just catch the enthusiasm and the fun of those games. So we are on every week, and then during the games, we'll have daily recaps.
Wheelchair rugby.
That's all
Everybody needs to watch wheelchair rugby in Paris. It is demolition derby and basketball put together.
Wow.
It's fun.
Okay.
It's great. It's great.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that. Wow. Thank you again so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Thank you. This is fun.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Jill and Alison from the Keep the Flame Alive podcast once again for taking the time to fill in a lot of the historical context and details about Chariots of Fire. Now, I know it's not summer yet, but as you get ready for the Summer Olympic Games, if you want to learn more about the Olympics and Paralympics, go check out Jill and Alison's podcast called Keep the Flame Alive. As they mentioned at the end, they'll actually be in Paris this year for the Summer Games, covering them on their podcast. So follow their show today to get updates on the Olympics before, during, and after the Games. You'll find a link to their podcast in the show notes for this episode, or you can always find it on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1. Sybil Gordon and Harold Abrams were married years before the timeline of the movie. Number 2. There were ads in the 1924 Olympics. Number 3. Lord Andrew Lindsay is not a real person. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's count it down and start with number 3. Lord Andrew Lindsay is not a real person. That is true. And by true, meaning that he was not a real person. As we learned, the character of Lord Lindsay in the movie is based on someone named David Burley. But Burley thought the movie was inaccurate, so he didn't let the filmmakers use his name. So they changed it to Lord Andrew Lindsay. Next, we have number 2. There were ads in the 1924 Olympics. That is also true. We learned that in 1924, the IOC, or the International Olympic Committee, was rather strapped for cash in the wake of World War I, so they allowed advertisers in Paris that year. And that's why we see ads in the games during the movie. That means the lie is number 1. Sybil Gordon and Harold Abrams were married years before the timeline of the movie. We learned that the primary reason that is the lie doesn't really have anything to do with the timeline, but it's because the movie simply got the wrong Sybil completely. As we learned, the movie has Sybil Gordon, who was a real person, but that is not who Harold Abrams got involved with. The woman he married was Sybil Evers, and he got involved with her after the timeline of the movie, not before. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If you heard ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed, either in Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. Learn all about that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value, or use the link in the show notes. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.